Dear participants, members of our judge panel and members of our team, welcome to the 14th edition of the Antwerp Medical Students Congress. Today I am sitting here filled with pride. On the one hand, because I was given the chance to organize the Congress. On the other hand, because I can say that I was a co-head of the most amazing organizing committee. The following 4 days are filled with topics that we think are not covered enough during our medical training. Therefore, our team has worked hard to find a composition with the most interesting and innovative topics. Presentations that will be happening in the following days show off your hard work and effort. Therefore, we would like to thank all the active participants. Since we also needed a judge panel, we would like to thank our judges who have given their free time voluntarily to help us. The only thing left to say now is to enjoy the Congress. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our very first lecture of AMSC 2020. My name is Christian, and I'm your host for this session. In the next hour and a half, we will be covering glycogen storage disease type 1A, a rare condition that affects the storage and usage of glycogen in the body. Professor Laurence Roosens, a clinical biologist, will provide you with the scientific side. Following that, a family with an affected member will talk about their personal experiences and daily living with the disease. Finally, after the presentations, we will have a Q&A session with questions from you at home. Leave them in the chat box at any time during the presentations or the Q&A, and we will propose them to our speakers. We hope you enjoy the lecture, and now, without further ado, let's switch over to our first speaker, Professor Laurence Roosens.
So, good afternoon, students. This is an extraordinary situation for me because I'm used to talking in front of a filled classroom, but I will be sure to make this presentation as extraordinary for all you listeners by talking about a very special molecule called glycogen. And we are going to talk about the dynamic life of the glycogen granule. Before we talk in detail about glycogen, I would like to locate glycogen within the entire metabolic pathway. Well, and we all know that we will kick off with a statement that we can all agree on. All of us, we are great. We are great, fascinating organisms, and we are able to do many extraordinary things. As you can see on this slide, we are able to grow, to move, to walk, and to achieve very special physical and mental milestones. And the most special thing about this is that we take all of this for granted. And the reason we can take these things for granted is because there is an entire cellular machinery which enables us to do all of these things. When we have a closer look at this biochemistry, we can see that we can divide all of these biochemical reactions into two large parts. The first part are all the catabolic reactions. And these are reactions where you take a substrate and you break it down. You break it down, and in order to produce energy, and inside biochemistry, energy means ATP. In the second part, you use this ATP in anabolic reactions. And in these reactions, you try to construct, or your body constructs, very specific molecules which you need to sustain life. And one of these molecules, for example, is glycogen. And to make glycogen, you use the ATP, which you generate during the catabolic reactions. When you have a closer look at this slide, you can see that our body uses three main sources of substrates. You have the carbohydrates, you have the proteins, and you have the fats. And because this talk is about glycogen, well, we will focus on carbohydrate metabolism. And we will focus on the catabolic and the anabolic side of carbohydrate metabolism. Now, carbohydrates are not just one of the three products you can use. Carbohydrates are extremely important for our biological functioning. And why is this? Well, we have certain tissues in our body which have an absolute requirement for carbohydrates, and glucose is here your main product. And you can see in this slide there are two tissues which are depicted, and it's the brain and the red blood cells. And these two tissues have an absolute requirement. This means they cannot function without a continuous input of glucose as product for their catabolic reactions. And as you can read here, we consume about 200 grams of glucose a day, and 80% of these 200 grams are immediately taken up by brain and by red blood cells. And as you know that in your cytoplasm and in your blood circulation there is only about 10 grams of glucose present, you can understand that your body needs to continuously replenish this glucose reservoir. If you don't do this, your brain and your red blood cells won't have enough glucose to function, and this is why a hypoglycemic patient will present itself with loss of consciousness, with confusion and disorientation. And when you reach a certain hypoglycemic state, will even evolve into coma. Now, it's easy for me to tell you that your blood glucose needs to stay within certain limits. But you all know we only eat 3 times a day. We have breakfast, we have lunch, and we have dinner. And 2 to 3 hours after each meal, your brain and your red blood cells are able to use the glucose which comes from your meal. But in between those times, well, when your blood glucose drops, this is the time when glycogen becomes very important and becomes essential for the function of your brain and your red blood cells. You can see when you look at this picture, the green line is the breakdown of glycogen, and you can see that the breakdown of glycogen becomes very important a few hours after each meal. And this is true because glycogen helps to keep the glucose level in your blood between certain concentrations. I mention it because you can see it in this picture. The red line, there is an additional pathway which serves to keep blood glucose levels sufficiently high during longer periods of starvation. This is an additional pathway and is very necessary and needed because you only have a certain amount of glycogen present in your body. When this glycogen has been depleted, you have to use another pathway. This is gluconeogenesis, and it's the pathway where your body takes other products and transforms them into glucose. But it's important for you to know that your body keeps this as a third line, a rescue line. Why? Because this pathway is very demanding for your body. It costs a lot of ATP. So only during longer periods of starvation, your body will use gluconeogenesis. Now, this extraordinary molecule called glycogen, let's have a closer look and see why glycogen is able to keep your blood glucose level between a certain concentration range. When you look at this picture, you see a picture of a hepatocyte. And during the fat state, your hepatocyte is filled with glycogen granules. You can see this on the picture. And glycogen is nothing more but a polysaccharide. So it's made up out of a lot of glucose molecules, and it serves as a storage form for glucose. And as it says on the slide, it's your first line of defense when your blood glucose levels drop. When you look at the picture, you can see glycogen consists of linear branches of glucose molecules, and they are connected one to another by 1.4 connections. But you cannot see that they are only linear chains. There are also branching points, and this is very important. These branching points are 1.6 connections because the glucose molecules connect to another molecule at another point. When you take all of these connections together, you get a cauliflower-like molecule, and on the outside, all the enzymes to break down glycogen are present. And a very large advantage to have that many endpoints and to have a cauliflower-shaped molecule enables us, when blood glucose levels drop, that a lot of enzymes can work simultaneously and can release a lot of glucose molecules at the same time and can very easily and rapidly release large amounts of glucose in the blood. So to summarize, what does glycogen do? Glycogen is made up out of glucose molecules. And during your meal, when there is an excess of glucose, your body takes the glucose and uses it to produce glycogen molecules, a storage form for later on when blood glucose levels are low. Only two tissues in your body are able to do this: the liver and muscles. This is very important. The only reason these two tissues can make glycogen is because they possess or express the necessary enzymes to make glycogen. Later on, after your meal, when blood glucose levels are dropping, the reverse will happen. The glycogen will be broken down in a process called glycogenolysis, and we know that glycogen is transformed back into glucose. And as I'm telling you this, I should make a small nuance, because it's not entirely true, and you will see it on the next slide. On the right-hand side of this slide, you can see the process in which glucose is transformed into glycogen. The first step is very important. Glucose is phosphorylated into glucose 6-phosphate by two types of enzymes. In all of our tissue, it happens by hexokinase, and only in the liver, this process is catalyzed by glucokinase. You get a molecule called glucose 6-phosphate, and this molecule, let's say, gets trapped in your cell. Because in your cell, you don't have a transporter for glucose 6-phosphate. So once you have the phosphorylated form, it cannot leave your cell, and it is destined to be metabolized further in your cell. There is something else you need to know about glucose 6-phosphate. It's like a crossroad or a crossing point of many metabolic pathways. Let's say, when you look at this slide, when you go down from glucose 6-phosphate, you produce glycogen. But you're also able to go to the right and to use glucose 6-phosphate to produce energy in a pathway we call glycolysis. Or you can go to the left. It's not depicted on the slide, but you can also use glucose 6-phosphate to make ribose 5-phosphate, the sugar which is essential to make purines and pyrimidines. Let's say our cell is in the situation that it would like to use glucose 6-phosphate to make glycogen. Well, we will have to activate this glucose, and we will make it into glucose UDP. This is an activated form, and we can connect all these UDP glucoses together in linear chains and in branches to construct an entire glycogen molecule. Let's say you want to break glycogen down, and you would want to do this when blood glucose levels are dropping. Well, then the reverse happens. You take your glycogen molecule and you break it down, not in the first step into glucose, but into a phosphorylated form of glucose, into glucose 1-phosphate, and you transform it back into glucose 6-phosphate. And this is a very important slide, because in this slide you can appreciate the difference between liver glycogen and muscle glycogen. Liver glycogen is very particular in one characteristic, namely the liver possesses a very special enzyme called glucose 6-phosphatase. This enzyme is able to take away the phosphate group and produce glucose. And as I mentioned before, your body or your cell has transporters for glucose. So once glucose is produced, it can easily leave the cell and make the blood glucose concentration turn it into a steady state. Leave you with concentrations which are viable for normal brain activity and normal red blood cell activity. This is why the liver is always referred to as a very altruistic organ. The liver looks after everyone else in your organism. It looks after every one of your tissues because it takes care of the blood glucose concentration. This is very different for muscle glycogen. Muscle glycogen does not express the glucose 6-phosphatase. And this means that the glycogen which is present in your muscle cannot be used for blood glucose concentration. Why? Because glucose 6-phosphate cannot leave the muscle cell, and it has to be used in one of the other pathways which crosses at the glucose 6-phosphate. And most of the time it will be used in glycolysis when muscle activity has to be sustained, for example, when there is a low amount of energy in your muscular system. So this is very important to realize, that only liver glycogen contributes to blood glucose, whereas muscle glycogen contributes only to their own activity of the muscle cells. And this is a little side note you can see on this slide. Of course, the hepatocyte has to be organized to sustain this function. Why? When you make glucose 6-phosphate and you transform it into glucose, well, the hepatocyte also likes glucose. So the formation of glucose is compartmentalized, just to make sure that all of the glucose which is formed due to the breakdown of glycogen, that we will use this glucose and export it out of the cell, and that it does not meet all of the other enzymes in the cytoplasm of the hepatocyte responsible for further degradation of glucose, let's say in the glycolysis. Okay. This is also important to know. I can tell you about different pathways, about making glycogen, about the breaking down of glycogen, but you can sense or you can feel that there has to be some kind of a regulation system. It's not efficient if all of these pathways would happen at the same time. And this is why in every metabolic pathway you have key enzymes which are active or non-active. And in this case, for glycogen, you understand that the activation of certain pathways depends on the fact if you are in a fat or a not fat state. Let's look, for example, at the synthesis of glycogen. There you have the glycogen synthase. When you look at the glycogen synthase, this enzyme will be sensitive for hormonal stimulation, meaning when you are in a fat state, there's a lot of glucose present, there will be a lot of insulin circulating in your organism. And this insulin will activate your glycogen synthase, meaning it will activate the formation of glycogen, and at the same time it will inactivate the breakdown of glycogen. On the other hand, you have glucagon. It's the reverse hormone. It's the hormone which signals or tells you, well, this body is in a non-fat state. It needs glucose. And what will this hormone do? This hormone will stimulate the glycogen phosphorylase, breaking down glycogen and producing glucose, which the body needs. You can also see a third hormone, epinephrine. It's mentioned here. It does the same or has the same net effect as glucagon, but it does not signal a non-fat state. It signals a stressful situation. But also here, your body will be in demand of extra glucose molecules. Not only hormonal regulation is important to activate or inactivate the glycogen metabolic pathways, we also have allosteric regulation of these enzymes. And it's not my purpose to talk to you a lot about enzymatic kinetics, but I do want to mention this. You have certain additional molecules which will make those two key enzymes work better or work faster. Work better means that they will be more active, also when there is less substrate available, and you can see this by following the green line, and less active, meaning an enzyme inhibition, making sure that this enzyme is not working very fast, even though there is a lot of substrate available. And this is clarified in my last slide. When you look at the liver, and when you look at muscle tissue, you can see that the synthesis of glycogen is stimulated by an activator of glycogen synthase, and this is glucose 6-phosphate, the substrate. This is very logical. But when you look specifically at the muscle tissue, you can see there are other activators there, activators of the breakdown of glycogen. And which are those activators? Well, for example, calcium and AMP. And this you can easily understand when you think about the function of muscle glycogen, because calcium signals that there is a lot of muscle activity, and AMP signals that there's a low amount of energy. So glycogen has to be broken down to produce glucose to sustain this muscle activity. So I tried to give you a short overview about the biochemistry of glycogen, but you know, just as I do, that nothing explains or underlines the importance of a molecule as does a patient telling about his condition, where he has a defect in glycogen metabolism and which are the consequences of this defect. So this is why I'm very happy to give the floor to Thijs and his family, and they will talk about the disorder, as been mentioned before, where this very important enzyme, glucose 6-phosphatase, is deficient in its function, meaning liver glycogen is not able to contribute to the blood glucose concentration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Roosens, for your great presentation. We will now go over to our family, but first we'll have to disinfect the material. So we'll be back, right back in a few minutes. See you then.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We are the family Serpent here. I'm Rick, the father. This is Thijs, our son, and this is my wife, Karen. Thijs is the subject matter for this afternoon. He is the patient attended with glycogen storage disease type 1A. We will tell our life story of living with this disease. It's known as glycogen storage disease type 1A. but a few synonyms are common, like GSD1A or von Gierke's disease, or glucose 6-phosphatase deficiency. Long ago, Thijs was a nice and pretty young boy. He was born in 1991, and on November 29th, he weighed approximately 2.8 kilograms and was measured about half a meter. Today he's a little taller than that. And he was born after a closely monitored pregnancy following a stillborn brother in 1990, 1 year before. He was born at 8.5 months after doctors detected weakened heart sounds and problems with the placenta. They performed an emergency C-section. And after that, I counted all his fingers and his toes. He had 10 fingers, 10 toes, so our dream on a pink cloud started off. Mom was very conscious, and she gave breastfeeding, but Thijs was an irregular drinker. However, my wife was a little bit stubborn, and she gave breastfeeding every time Thijs cried, although that was against the advices of doctors and nurses. But after all, this may have been Thijs's salvation. Our dream lasted for about 3 months. When Thijs became ill, he got fever and was hospitalized because he didn't drink or eat anymore. So he was hospitalized in a local hospital where doctors detected hepatomegaly. He was having acusmal bleeding, lactacidosis, cholesterolemia, and of course severe hypoglycemia. The local hospital referred us after about a week to a university hospital in Ghent, to Dr. Carton, who constated immediately a palpable liver and saw that Thijs has a cherub facies. He murmured 2 pathologies, and one of them was GSD1A, but of course on site it is not given process to diagnose someone on site. A liver biopsy gave the definite answer a few days later, and it was in effect von Gierke's disease, or glycogen storage disease 1A. Immediately our dream was scattered, and our parental education, as we call it, was started off. Dr. Carton made clear that Thijs was treatable, but not curable. He was treatable with a very strict Spartan diet. And he said, literally, it doesn't come to a second, but a minute will make a difference. And this is something we have taken to our heart and have used throughout our life. And we made it our mission. It's our mission to deliver Thijs at adulthood, giving him all the chances a normal child has, so that he can function normally within society. But at that moment, our life started to function for timing, vigilance, and a lot of stress. We started then our tremendous obstacle course. If you are before it and people would explain you what you have to go through, you never started. But this was something that went gradually, so we have done it at last. We were lucky to have a huge support by a medical corps, by paramedical corps, by family and friends. And to illustrate this, I can tell you that, for example, Dr. Carton and even Dr. Logger of the local hospital, they rang us daily in the beginning, asking how it was with Thijs. So the diet that was started in order to bypass the function, the classical function of the liver, and to avoid the storage of glycogen, creates in the same time a food aversion with those patients, which is not a good thing. If you have to gap every 2-3 hours and you only have your food that you have eaten as a reserve, because you want to bypass the liver function to store glycogen, you have to eat so many times that you get a food aversion. So in the beginning we started to switch from breastfeeding to bottle feeding, but they refused that. So that was the first obstacle we had to overcome. And to do that, a nasogastric tube was put in place, and Thijs was fed through this nasogastric tube. In the beginning that was tube feeding, that was dripped through a IV system and a feeding pump. Afterwards that became more solid meals. But at the same time, Thijs excelled in vomiting. So he vomited very, 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 very much. And to prevent hypoglycemias, we had to catch the vomit in towels, weigh those towels in order to assess how many food he had vomited, in order to give it back to him through the same tube feeding. So that was a constant fight to not have hypoglycemias. So at first the tube feeding was on a continuous basis. Later on it became only at night, but still tube feeding. One of the problems with the nightly tube feeding was that, of course, the system is built on connections that go through tubes, and connections can get loose. So we have had several times that there was a leakage in the system, causing, of course, you can guess it, hypoglycemias. So we have found Thijs multiple times in the morning with severe hypoglycemias, and his bed was wet instead. So the fluid, the tube feeding, had flown into his bed instead of into Thijs. So we went out on a search to prevent those leakages, and finally we found a system that's called a pee alert. It's used for children who pee in their bed at night, to monitor them and to alert them when this piece of cloth with a wire in it becomes wet. It triggers an alert, and we have used it to wrap the connections in. So when those connections became wet or leaked, we got an alert. During the year, Thijs and his mother have had several hospitalizations in the system of mother-child, and that was something that was very good for Thijs, but also very good for the hospital, because his diet was so strict. Thijs has to eat, for example, at 8:15, at 10:10, at 12:30, at 3 o'clock, at 4 o'clock, at 7 o'clock, at 10 o'clock p.m., at 11 o'clock p.m. And for the nursing staff in the hospital, this was a too strict and too intense schedule for them to follow. So they were happy that my wife, mainly from time to time myself, we were present in order to do the follow-up of the diet, so that everything went okay. In the same time, we started a number of processes to achieve a status of or a recognition of handicap, because with this disorder you cannot do everything that normal persons do. You need to park quite close to where you go in order to escape if it's needed with hypoglycemia. So we had to undergo several medical examinations, and it was very difficult to explain to the doctors who had to check our story for insurance and health insurance institute, to make them clear that a chronic, life-lasting, life-threatening disease like GSD1A is actually lifelong, life-threatening and chronic, and that you cannot fake it, or that it doesn't change on a year. And finally, TACE has received a lifelong recognition at the age of 23. So we have had a fight for 23 years to get this recognition. And in the beginning, we went armed with the IV stand, the tube feeding, the feeding pump, all operating to the doctor, presenting TACE, and most of the time the doctor didn't examine him, but he just filled in some paperwork, and we could go again. In 1993, and that was a very busy year for us, the nasogastric tube feeding became more and more regular for us, and we have had to replace this nasogastric tube normally every 6 weeks, which is not a pleasant experience. It's painful, and for a little child, which you cannot explain what's happening and why you are doing some things, it's very terrifying, even haunting, and in the end it's also traumatizing, not only for TACE but also for us as parents. Luckily we were 2 of us. My wife is nurse herself, so she could do that herself. But when you have a child that is not wanting you to put a nasogastric tube, he is defending himself, so I had to immobilize TACE while my wife was putting the nasogastric tube in place. So we were in fact on a continuous fight with our own son. But we did not have time to comfort or consoling him, because most of the time when a tube had to be replaced, that was because he had vomited, and he was a specialist in vomiting. He could vomit and the tube came out of his mouth, went in through his nose, so you have to do something, you cannot put it back. So that was tearing out the tube that was in place, putting another into him, and making sure that he got the same amount of food that he just had vomited back, and we had to do that in a few minutes time in order to avoid severe hypoglycemias. Another friend of TACE is the rotavirus, causing gastroenteritis and blocking the complete intestines, resulting also in vomiting and diarrhea, and also this results in hypoglycemia after 15 minutes, which is irreversible at that time. So we have had several hospitalizations in the really fast and furious style, because we did not want to wait for an ambulance to come at our home. We drove ourselves multiple times, which I would not recommend to anyone, because it's very exhausting, it's very stressful, and it's very riskful. And finally, after those first 3 years, TACE went to school, went to kindergarten, but unluckily in November 1994, when he became 3 years old, he got the herpes simplex virus, which causes normally a fever blister, and it passes without very much ado. But for TACE this was a little bit different. It escalated enormously, it resulted in a heart failure in the local hospital, heart decompensation. So the local hospital decided to refer Thijs to the University Hospital of Ghent, where they took Thijs immediately to high care intensive care. And after a few days, I remember it very well, it was a Sunday morning, I think. We received a phone call from the high care intensive care department saying we didn't have to rush ourselves, we didn't have to panic, but Thijs had just done a cardiac arrest and was reanimated at the time. So they say, come to Ghent, but do not rush something, try to keep calm and relax. I can guarantee you go as zen as possible to the hospital at that moment. After those weeks in high care intensive care, there was a long period of rehabilitation because Thijs had lost a lot of weight, had lost a lot of muscle. He had to learn to walk again, so we were back to square one. During that time at high care intensive care, there had been administered a drug which the doctors asked us, may we give this to Thijs? It's either helping him or it's not going to help him. So we said, of course, give it to him if it can help him and if it can save him, do not hesitate. Only Thijs has done a ototoxic reaction on that drug, and that has caused a hearing loss, which was determined in 1995 in kindergarten when the teacher said, I think that Thijs is not hearing as well as the other kids because he does not respond as the other kids does. He misses tasks if we ask it to him. So we went to a ear, nose, throat specialist who effectively detected this hearing loss. So that was an additional problem. Thijs has, in the meantime, hearing aids. He has FM equipment, which is a system of a microphone that can be given to a speaker like I am at the moment, and a receiver that Thijs wears with him so that he can hear the speaker in prior, because against all other environment noises. So we had to take that into account to create the necessary awareness in our environment. In November 1995, that's we are just 1 year later, Thijs was re-hospitalized again, but this time due to an erroneous diet application. One of us, I do not remember who, but one of us forgot his cornstarch, which is a cornerstone of his diet. You remember, we have long chains of sugar, we have very short chains of glucose. Well, cornstarch is a long chain of sugar and is a key of his diet, together with, for example, maltodextrose, which is a medium chain. So if we forgot cornstarch, that meant that after an hour and a half, Thijs' blood glucose levels were dropping, and they were not anticipated on by the cornstarch. So he makes hypoglycemia, and this time it was a very severe hypoglycemia. I remember he had a value of, I think, 22 millimole. So that is really, really, really low. He had also convulsions, and I had to call the emergency doctor. But unfortunately, this doctor assessed Thijs' situation as just an aggressive child. Thijs had convulsions, was laying on the ground, and the doctor thought this is just an aggressive child, even though I tried to explain him the condition of Thijs, saying he needs glucose right away, 10% or even 5% if you have it, but he needs glucose. In the meantime, my wife was back from shopping, and when Thijs was put into the ambulance, she saw that there was only administered physiological fluid instead of glucose. Luckily, it was the beginning of the mobile phones, so she took her mobile phone, rang the local hospital where the pediatrician was present, and he explained to the emergency doctor that they needed glucose 10%. For us, this incident, this issue, was the trigger to create an emergency kit containing everything that's needed in an emergency. For example, 2 bottles of glucose 10%, a complete IV set, Valium to stop convulsions, several solutions of glucose. The only thing we cannot put in such a box is a doctor, because they are a little larger than the box. But we have that always with us. We will put this box here in front. We can show later on what's inside. We also have documented at that time his diet, an emergency procedure, and so on, so that in the future, because we hope that we would have a bright future ahead of us, we would not have this problem anymore. During primary school, everything went as usual, because we were getting used to it. So there were several hospitalizations due to the stomach flu. We needed several times medical emergency service. We played several times Fast and the Furious with self-service in rushing days to a hospital. But something good was that the nasogastric tube, which was in Thijs' face, of course, was replaced by a gastrostomy. So that was, for socializing Thijs, that was a very important step. But a lot of other things were that, for example, Thijs could not do sports at school. School trips had to be adapted in order to get Thijs with the school, because we did not want to lay all the responsibility to the education staff or to the school staff. So we went with every school trip, we went with him, although in the background, but we were present. His mom and her mother, his grandmother of Thijs, took meals to school. So that was at 10 o'clock, at noon he was coming home, at 3 o'clock, at 4 o'clock, so they drove every time to the school and back home. On other occasions, like parties or whatever, Thijs had always to follow a custom schedule. Even on his first Holy Communion, Thijs was at the party, he was eating alone, because it was half 12:30, he had to eat. All the other people were still enjoying their drinks, but Thijs had to eat, so he ate alone. He also had, in that period of time, he also had several fractures, because one of the side effects of glycogen storage disease is apparently that there is some form of osteoporosis. And he once tried to skimboard at sea, and he fell, and his wrist was broken in 2 places, so it was immediately finished with skimboarding. In that same period, we started psychological coaching for him, because he had a lot of fears. He was afraid of dying. He was afraid of everything that was happening around him. He had to prick several times a day, so he had to accept his disability. All this was quite difficult, but maybe the most important is that Thijs, at the age of 6, still did not eat solid food. It was like that even if we presented a slice of bread to Thijs, he started gagging. ultimately vomiting, so we went into problems. And there was only one solution, and that was someone that we had learned through a documentary on television, who was giving eating therapy, and she has, during the course of 1 year, learned taste to eat, and she started crumb by crumb, by first presenting a crumb, and then applauding Thijs for doing it so well. Second step was putting the crumb on his lip, on the tip of his tongue, and so on. So after a full year of therapy, Thijs finally started to eat, since he did stop. It's also the period in which we undertook our first journeys. So that's a camp to Spa, a location here in Belgium, and a intersoc holiday with medical assistance. During his secondary education, that was a major adjustment for Thijs, because the local school, the primary school and kindergarten was local in our village, but secondary education was in the big town of Roeselare. So that was a completely new school. Board didn't know Thijs' condition, teachers didn't know, staff didn't know. So we had to explain the condition, the diet treatment. We had, in fact, to ask if they would accept Thijs. Luckily they did, and they were very open to him. But we also had to ask to put some medical material at their disposition in school, some spare material. Luckily my wife worked also in the same town, so she was able to follow up on his diet on a daily basis. In the same period, they also started a guidance program that's called GON, that's a short for Integrated Education. It's a Dutch abbreviation. To work around his hearing problem, concentration problems, and in order to learn Thijs how to organize himself so that he was able to live more independently. It was not all bad. We also had great experiences, like in 2007, where we could make a trip to Dallas to watch a NBA match of the Dallas Mavericks. That was something that's been made possible by Make-A-Wish. Government also supported us, so we started in that period also the personal assistance budget. That's a budget that's allocated to patients who can buy with this budget support, various forms of support. And the nocturnal tube feeding was replaced during that period with a product that's called glycosate. Glycosate is in fact a string of cornstarch that's been modified through heat and moist, and it allows Thijs during the night to bridge a time period of 4 hours and 45 minutes instead of the classical 3 hours between two meals. It's 4 hours and 45 minutes, not 5 hours, not 4 hours 50, because we see that after 4 hours 45 minutes, his glucose level in the blood is dropping drastically. So that means that Thijs is during the night has to take an extra portion of glycosate. Mainly it's around 3:40 in the night. That means he has to wake up. But with his hearing problems, Thijs does not hear a alarm. So that means that either my wife or I, we still get up at night to check that Thijs has taken his extra portion of glycosate. If he does not, we find him in the morning around 8 o'clock with a severe hypoglycemia, resulting in needing this emergency kit and a hospitalization. After secondary education, we were lucky that Thijs was evolving very good, that his education went prosperous. He could go to university because we had tried to avoid as many hypoglycemias as possible. He could follow his dream, and he wanted to try to get a Master of Science in history. We asked him several times if he had a plan B to get something else than history, and the plan B was Master of Science in history. After that Master of History, which took him to University of Leuven also, he achieved in Brussels a master after master in archive and how is it called? Document management and archiving. And he has kept a number of good friendships. However, also that trip to Leuven was not without problems. We had read in a brochure of the university that they had a dazzling proposal of supported living for students with a disability. It consisted of a residence where students with a disability lived together with students without a disability, and the students without the disability took care of the students with a disability. So we thought, this is it. This is the golden egg, until we explained Thijs his condition at the university and said that, in fact, if you do not treat hypoglycemia, it's a life-threatening condition, and as a lightning strike, it was refused. So the support was refused. We found that this could not be the case, and we started a intervention by UNIA, which is a government agency that takes care of discrimination and so on. So we said that Thijs was discriminated on basis of his medical condition, which we found unfair. And thanks to this intervention by UNIA and their work, Thijs has been admitted. But still, he was admitted in the residence, but the students were not allowed to support him. So we had to organize our own support, which we have done by hiring a nurse, a home nurse for Thijs in the morning, and we have found a project that took care of elder people during the night in the area of Leuven, and they agreed to visit Thijs every night at the same time, exactly to check if he had taken his glycosate at night. So that was organized by us. We have asked the responsibles of the residence if, in case of fire, for example, students might alert Thijs, and that was allowed. So that was the only support they gave him. Moreover, when after a year a new student with a disability wanted to visit the residence in order to see what's available and how it worked, it was asked to Thijs, can we visit your room? Thijs said, yes, of course, that's no problem. But he got a reaction, oh, you're not in a wheelchair, so you don't look handicapped. So there's still some kind of stigma that people who are not in a wheelchair cannot be handicapped. Other fears arise, like fears in relationships to be dropped. He was by then a young man of 18, 20, 22 years. So he was feared by being dumped in relationships. It was not easy to build relationships in the first place because he cannot make carefree trips. He cannot go wild at festivals or at a campus or whatever that students do. So he was always inhibited. After university, Thijs starts working at the Watergroep, which is the same company as I work for, as an expert in data retention and archiving, so which is in his education. And luckily, the Flemish government has provided an integration protocol that makes it a little bit easier for Thijs and other people with a disability to work for government. Also, we have to do the same explanation at work. We have a second emergency kit at the office, so that colleagues can intervene, that doctors can intervene when necessary. In May 2017, a abnormal low level of testosterone was diagnosed in Thijs, which was at that time the 5th patient with GSD1A diagnosed with this condition worldwide. And the condition is hypogonadotropic hypogonadism. And in order to increase his level of testosterone, Thijs injects himself 2 times a week with Pregnil. In the meantime, his testosterone level is normalized, but during that time he had some form of depression. He wasn't feeling very well, so that was another effect of the condition. So we are living constantly with stress, with fears, with psychological coaching, with uncertainty. All this leads to a low self-image for Thijs. My wife is half-time working to get all administration up to date and in order. We have to make sure that all reserves and emergency kits are up to date, that they are checked, that they are replenished when necessary. We have our nightly checks, that's for 24/7, 365 days a year. So you can imagine this has a huge social impact on the family. During these times of the corona pandemic, we always said that we are a little bit used to it because we live already 30 years in some form of isolation. Thijs had a relationship, and as he feared, it has broken off after 6 years. Nowadays he is sporting, he is a huge fan of basketball, but he does it in a wheelchair, in a national and European competition. We have good contacts in order to follow up developments in the treatment or possible treatments of GSD with several teams here at University of Antwerp, but also the University of Ghent, Leuven, in Groningen, where there's a very good team. We follow up the phase 1 clinical trials with gene therapy for patients with GSD1A. We have collaborated with Maastricht University in the research on fatty liver and arteriosclerosis, the relation with GSD1A. And yeah, as I mentioned just before, we work yet 6 months from home. We are used to our social isolation, and this is our story. So you can imagine this is not an easy job. It's not been easy, it's still not easy, but we are proud that we have brought Thijs where he is, that he is able to function autonomously within society at a, let's say, normal level. Thank you very much, and if there are questions, we will hear it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
thank you very much for your presentation and your story. We will be going over to the Q&A, so if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. We will be disinfecting the place, so we will be back in a few minutes. Stay tuned for that. All right. Well, firstly, thank you once again for speaking at our Congress. We would like to, so now we're going to ask some questions that people at home can ask.
Okay.
You can still, at this moment, put your questions in the comments and we'll propose them. I'm going to start with the first one that came in, which was, what about gene therapy? Are there possible, could provide solutions for your problems in the future?
As said in the last slide, we are currently following or monitoring quite closely some projects on gene therapy that are in a clinical phase trial 1. This is very immature at the moment, or in a very early stage of development, but there's the effects seen during the tests are very good, so we are quite hopeful that between this and 5, 10, 15 years there will be a gene therapy possible for GSD type 1A. There are of course about 10 types of GSD, so each type has his own specific problems and solutions eventually.
Mm-hmm. You also quickly touched on the pandemic and how you have to, live with the situation you're in. That you already have a lot of experience, and that does help you right now. Could you touch on that subject a bit more? Could you elaborate what you meant by that?
Estes is a risk patient, or belongs to the group of risk patients. We were quite anxious, or we had some fear of trapping the COVID-19 virus. So we are living in a very close, very small bubble, and we restricted our social contacts. Surely in the first wave of the pandemic, much more than before, in order not to have the disease, neither us as parents, but surely not Thijs, because it's not known what the effect is on patients with a lower immune system.
Yeah, it's still very unknown. Obviously, you have a rare disease, a very rare disease. How is there any association, or what are the associations that can bring people with the same disease or similar diseases together? Can people that you can talk with, or
Yeah, well, as you said, there are not many people, not many patients with the disease, but via social media I was able to track some patients down from different countries, not only from Belgium, but mostly from the Netherlands, because I speak Dutch, they speak Dutch, it's easy, but not only the Netherlands, but also Canada, America, Great Britain, and so on. But yeah, it's not easy because there are not many, and if I find them, mostly they are younger than me, or Yeah, they're younger than me, and it's not easy to share experiences.
Yes.
Even though we have the same disease, it does not mean we share the same experience or went to the same things and so on. But it is possible to find some patients with the same experiences.
Mm. I'm going to ask a more biochemical question now. Are there any other pathways that supply energy active in patients with the disease, such as fatty acid oxidation or gluconeogenesis?
Well, yes, of course. So, as I showed you in the slides, the defect is very localized. So it's the glucose 6-phosphatase enzyme which is deficient. But you know that ATP generation is linked through oxidative phosphorylation, and you have a lot of pathways which enter there. So let's say fatty acid oxidation generates ketones, which can also be used by the brain, or you can generate acetyl coenzyme A through beta oxidation, and that is also an influx in the Krebs cycle and feeds the oxidative phosphorylation. So certainly you have other building blocks which you can use for ATP generation, but as I mentioned in the slides, the glycogen has such a specific goal in your metabolism that it is a hard let's say, compound to replace.
Thank you. Another question we have is this time for our family. What would you like to say to couples going through the same situation with their child? Is there anything you would like to have done differently than you have done in the past?
No, the main thing to remember to make it possible for a patient to live a life as normal as it can be, or as normal as we think it is, and to give it the possibility to take part in the community, in the society, on a regular basis and function normally, is do avoid hypoglycemias. Be strict in the diet, and as Dr. Carton said to us in the early days of after the diagnosis of TACE, the diet is it doesn't come on a second. You can't skip a second, and it can be 2 seconds also, but be sharp on the minute. We have had situations where it was time for TACE to eat, and for instance in a holiday resort, and they said, yes, it's coming. Okay, we wait 2 minutes, 5 minutes. We asked again. Oh yes, it's coming. It will be there immediately. And time passed by, and it became 15 minutes. And after 15 minutes, we took a finger prick of TACE, and he had a hypoglycemia. So he had a glycemia of somewhere low 50s or something like that, which is not normal. So we had to react. If you can avoid such situations, that is of golden value for patients like them. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question, and this will be for the professor once more. So one of our commenters has read that hepcidin-producing adenomas could be found in the liver of patients with the disease. What is the mechanical link for that, and how do they affect the patient's condition? Do you know?
Well, when you look at the pathology, it's easy to understand the link or the function that the liver has, because with the condition of TAS, TAS is able to make glycogen. So you are able to fill your liver with glycogen granules. The problem is that you are not able to use the glycogen in an efficient manner. So the liver is much more stressed than in a normal individual. And the hepatomegaly you see is because the liver is filled with granules, but you cannot use them efficiently. So you see that in a later stage, because the liver is so stressed, that you have a higher opportunity of malignancies in the liver. So the link between liver malignancies in a later stage is because the liver is much more stressed, and because you have a liver filled with granules. If you do not have the good control of the generation of the glycogen, then this can certainly be a problem in a later stage.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I also want to say that we don't only have received questions, but also compliments that people understand a lot more of living with the disease as well, and that they found it very interesting. So I want to thank you all very much for coming. It has been a pleasure, and thank you for joining at home. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.